Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So I want to thank Beth and her team. They've been really great in allowing us to squeeze in this panel around ESSA. As she said, I'm very involved in that within our organization. And thank you all for coming. This is really an amazing turnout. So we're so excited to have you here. And I know, as our team has said, they've been working on this for a while, and I think they feel very gratified that the presence of everybody here in the room. So thank you so much for being here. So we're kicking off this conversation, the conference today, with a conversation around the Every Student Succeeds Act and the plans that were just submitted. And so I'm just curious in this room, how many of you were involved in the development of your state's plan? Okay, that's a lot. I bet you're glad you're done, right?
Yes.
Woo! But, you're not really done. Well, okay, Alabama isn't. But no one in this room is actually done. I mean, the plans are done, but the plans are really the beginning of a process. And at AIR, you've heard us talk about our ESSA co-pilot. We sort of think of the implementation of ESSA as a trip. And the plan is your itinerary. So I know when I develop a plan, I'm taking a trip, I talk to everybody I know who's been where I've been, or is also maybe planning the same trip, and what are you finding, what are you doing? And I get that information and I have it inform my itinerary. So I make my plans, I book my reservations, but I'm still talking to people. And as I talk to people, I find out, oh, somebody's done this. We really have to do that. And so sometimes you add a little side trip in. But sometimes what you find out is so fabulous, you really make a major restructuring of your trip, and maybe you take a little hit on some of your change fees because you know that experience is going to give you the best opportunity possible. And that's how we see the implementation of ESSA is the plan is your itinerary. But it's not done. It's your roadmap, but it gives you flexibility to change. So people in the room who are here today hopefully will be sharing information, learning new things. And so when you go back, it's an opportunity to really think about the evolution of the implementation and how things can change. And so, as we mentioned, we have a website, the ESSA Co-Pilot, and it's a place where you can find a lot of ESSA-related resources, including links not only to the state-submitted plans, but also to each state's ESSA page. And one of the things I encourage you to think about is that your ESSA page not being done. You've got the plan submitted, it's up there, that's it, but really using it as an opportunity to share updates on your implementation because your colleagues are all interested to know what's happening and if you're putting new resources out, how they can access them. So as we think about, our ESSA resources and how we're going to now support and share what we're learning about implementation efforts, I encourage you to do the same with your state pages. So for today's conversation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each speaker one at a time and pose a question to them. They're going to answer that question and share a little bit of information. And then once we're done, we're going to open the conversation up to questions from participants. If you have a burning question, feel free to raise your hand. But we've really allowed a block of time for Q&A because we know that we're here to answer your questions. And so, so that's sort of how the program will be structured for today. We're going to start with Jim Squires, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Center on Enhancing Early Learning Outcomes, CELO, which is a comprehensive center operated by the National Institute for Early Education Research. Jim is really an ideal person to kick off this panel because he's walked in your shoes. So he was formerly the Early Childhood Programs Coordinator at the Vermont Department of Education and a past president of the National Association of Early Childhood Specialists in State Departments of Education. So he's great to kick us off today. So Jim, one of the things that I'm hoping you can talk about is the work that CELO was involved in helping states develop their ESSA plans. And I'm wondering if you can talk about where there were new opportunities in ESSA for states to build upon the work they're already doing in early childhood. With the support you provided to states, was there anything new or different that caught your eye? And lastly, what do you see as your next phase of work in the implementation of these plans?
Apologies to those of you over there who I can't see. But I also wanted to say I'm joined here by Namaya, who she's a little symbol as we do our work. I always like to carry her with me. I don't always bring her out. It's a young child in a wheelchair. Namaya is her name. She's a dual language learner. And as we talk about policies, procedures, implementation science, etc., I always like to have some little memory jog to keep it real. So in my notes, I'm going to sit down. Again, apologies to those of you whose vision is blocked. But I have a few comments that I'd like to make, and many of them actually speak to the questions that were posed by Trish. So first of all, I want to say that many states have made great gains in terms of early childhood. We still are a little uncertain what we mean by P3. Is it birth through third grade? Is it prenatal? Is it pre-K? That's okay. We're still moving forward. A lot of the planning that we see appearing within ESSA plans actually has been in place for many years, partly because of the federal government's role in terms of the Race to the Top, Early Learning Challenge grants, preschool development and expansion grants. There was the sometimes referred to as the SEX grants, the state comprehensive services systems through maternal child health. So many people in states and early childhood circles have been working on plans for many years, and a great deal of planning has come forward. What ESSA did was it gave a new opportunity to states. And as we know, there's a lot of opportunities that became available through ESSA, such as in Title I for disadvantaged students, in Title II around professional preparation and development, principals, not just teachers, also opportunities for community-based early childhood programs, Title III with migrant and English language learners, Title IV. There have been many opportunities there, and I'm not going to delineate each and every opportunity. But I will say that it really did support a P3 or a B3 approach being infused into what has really been the 20th century model of education in the United States, which is K-12. This is trying to break that mold, move into the 21st century, and have it be P12, P20, P. Expectations were very high among the early childhood community when ESSA came out because of these opportunities, and many, the federal government and many organizations produce can-do documents, the non-regulatory guidance out of the education department for how early education has opportunities in ESSA to be infused. We saw that. We saw the National Governors Association, NCSL, the Council of Chief State School Officers, New America Build, many others, Bellwether, really try to help states organize and make sure that early childhood was at the table. Fortunately, early childhood did have a very prominent seat at the table, and we know this because of people such as Commissioner Wright, who is, or is it Superintendent? I'm sorry, Superintendent Wright, and in neighboring Alabama, where Commissioner Ross, who will be here later to speak, she actually chaired the ESSA Planning Committee. So we know that early childhood definitely had a seat at the table. What we have found is that many states took full advantage of infusing P3 into early childhood. And at CELO, we were trying to encourage states to, number one, know what your opportunities are, and then when you're at the table, know how to ask it and get it in the final document. There are some states where a great deal of planning happened among the stakeholders, and when the final plans were written, people, some of the people said, I was expecting there would be more, or more prominently stated in our plans. That said, we find that in many, many states that have been, have their ESSA plans in, and I confess, I have not read all 50 state plans. I think it's something I wouldn't wish on anybody, perhaps, but I have not read them. However, my colleagues at CELO, Lori Connors-Tadros, Rolf Graf-Wallner from CCSSO, who is also a partner in CELO, they have read them and can provide more specifics to them. So what we were seeing, Trish, is also that advocates and stakeholders were they were at the table, they were driving forces in terms of trying to have a greater continuity, coherence for P3 within this whole K-12 spectrum, and the results are there. We do think, going back to thinking perhaps there were some missed opportunities for states, we know that the window is not fully closed on that, and we also think perhaps some states might have under-promised with the hope of over-delivering. That they may not have appeared in their state plans, but that doesn't mean that it's not on somebody's radar to make it happen. That's a strategy some have used in the past, particularly when accountability looms so large. So what has CELO done? We have partnered with states in various ways. We have reviewed at the request of some states as they've developed some of their plans to look at things such as workforce preparation, leadership issues, looking at infusing the whole P3 mechanism. And I have to say, while I'm a snowbird, I do reside in Georgia half the year, and at NEAR, we really do look to the Southeast as having a lot of very powerful, innovative state education departments when it comes to early education. Starting perhaps with Zell Miller, the governor in Georgia, having made universal pre-K a priority for his state, and we're seeing ripple effects. John Pruitt, who will be introduced shortly, I could go around the room and actually point to many people. There's a lot of great things happening here. I want to tell you some of the things that we are striving for. We know that some state departments of education or SOELs, state offices of early learning, such as DECAL, quite a few states have a separate agency addressing either P3 or birth to 5, in addition to a separate state Department of Education. We have been focusing on building leadership capacity within the states. Because there are more opportunities, that typically means there will be more work. Well, we need to ensure that there are more people with the proper skills, leadership, understanding who understand the work and also can ensure successful implementation. And so that's one of the areas we have worked on through, say, the CELO Leadership Academy, where we have had several graduates move up into positions. And we have a few other things coming up on tap. So let me just tell you a few more of these. We obviously want to partner very closely with the regional comprehensive centers. Personally, I work with CAT and the Southeast Comprehensive Center. We want to maintain these relationships and strengthen these relationships so that state agencies don't have to work harder for us. You know, we're here to serve everybody. So how we can coordinate with RELs and RCCs. A couple of things that will be coming up. At the end of October, CELO will be co-producing with Bellwether a state summary of promising practices of state early childhood ESSA plans. So that's one thing to keep your eyes open for. Another piece that's coming out with our partners from CCSSO is a birth through third grade toolkit for SEAs. We know that Illinois is already using it to some extent, Elliot Regenstein, and it's focusing a lot on K2 education. So how can you sustain those early gains that we're seeing happen? CELO has an ESSA blog series, so we will bring your attention to that as well. Also, CCSSO wanted me to let you know because Rolf Wallner was unable to attend. He wanted to say that very shortly there will be a model MOU made available for SEAs to work with Head Start. As you may know, there is a collaboration piece in there, and so that will make those types of MOUs very possible. And finally, we will continue to work with states and groups such as National Association of Elementary School Principals around principal leadership, which we see as being a really critical piece, and KEA implementation as well.
Great. Next up, we have John Pruitt. He is the Executive Director of North Carolina's Office of Early Learning, and he's also the current president of the National Association of Early Childhood Specialists in State Departments of Education. So I think that he and Jim are a little bit thick as thieves in our area. So some of the questions we'd like you to think about, John, is now that we've heard a general approach to how states were incorporating it into their ESSA plans, and Silo giving that big picture, we'd like to hear about your individual experience working in a state. Can you talk about working with the stakeholder organizations, and was there working with the legislature either actively or had something happened already you could capitalize on? In particular, can you share some more information about the B through grade 3 interagency council and how that council is helping expand the conversation about school transitions? So we're not just focusing on, elementary to middle to high school, but really addressing those early grade transitions.
First, let me set some context. North Carolina, has a rich history of collaboration in the early childhood space. We have a very strong Smart Start statewide organization. We have a very strong Head Start collaboration office that operates out of my office. We have a storied history of how the Department of Public Instruction and how Health and Human Services work together to really advance and support programming for children in North Carolina. We also have a General Assembly that has recently began to focus on strengthening the continuum of education from birth through grade 3. We're a third grade reading proficiency state, and now the conversation has really moved towards how do we support children's growth and success across the continuum and not think about just success in the third grade. That being said, when the opportunity to write the state plan for ESSA came about, it was really fortuitous in that it gave us a vehicle to really speak to how to strengthen that continuum. And in an effort to really be well informed, it was important to hear from early childhood stakeholders. It made little sense for my team and the Department of Public Instruction to singularly try to influence what this plan looked like, but to really reach out to the early childhood community and have focus groups and sessions to really gain an essence of what stakeholders felt like should be addressed in our state plan. That being said, we work very closely with the North Carolina Early Childhood Foundation, Tracy Zimmerman. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her, but she is a force to be reckoned with, I should say, and a great partner as we think about early childhood in our state. So we worked very closely with her and hosted a series of webinars for early learning, local education agency, community, and state leaders, sharing the opportunities that existed in the reauthorization of Every Student Succeeds Act. And really talk to them about what do you want to see lifted up, what do you want to see elevated. We convened early learning and education leader professionals at the National Smart Start Conference. Danielle came in and facilitated that conversation. And really, again, focused on what are the things that we want to highlight in the state plan. The State Board of Education engaged early childhood stakeholders, brought in focus groups to speak to the state board, as well as business groups, as well as district leaders, superintendents, principals, teachers, etc. But I thought it was of particular importance that there was a group that was specifically focusing on early learning and the 0 to 8 continuum that was informing the plan. So lots of great ideas got put forward. I will say in its first iteration in some of the drafts, North Carolina was one of those states that had lots of great input from the early childhood community. And in looking at the draft, the response of the early childhood community was, wow, I thought there would have been more, right? And that led to a conversation with Tracy Zimmerman to let's see if we can ignite the early childhood community to voice their displeasure in the fact that much of what they put forward is not included in the plan. And that in fact happened, which resulted in another draft that included a lot of early childhood elements. So a word to the wise, work with your partners. Outside pressure can do a lot to move mountains. So where are we now? We have a plan, it's been submitted to the feds, but really where the rubber meets the road, and I think all of you know this, is how districts choose to spend their money. And so I think what the state plan does is it speaks to expectations and opportunities, but really where the strong work can occur is at the district level planning. And so we're entering this next phase of engaging our stakeholders and communities to really work around raising awareness, talk about what are the opportunities with school districts and early childhood stakeholders within individual communities. We're really working to move towards convening regional meetings so that we bring those partners together at the local level. North Carolina is a state with 100 counties and 115 school districts, and the relationships amongst those districts and early childhood providers vary. And so we see this as a great opportunity to think about how to build those bridges to work to strengthen early childhood. And finally, we're going to provide coaching and technical assistance for district plan development. And so there will be an RFP process where we'll be working with a number of districts to really dig deeply and helping them think thoughtfully about how to use the resources that are available through all the different titles to support a stronger continuum. Lots of work ahead, but important work, and really looking forward to getting started on that. You mentioned the Birth Through Grade 3 Agency Council. That is, in current legislation, actually was included a special provision language in the budget bill establishing a council that is co-chaired by the Department of Public Instruction and Department of Health and Human Services, and really is about creating a strategic vision for early education. We see that council as a way to hold both the state and locals accountable to really advancing early education and putting forth structures that support children's growth and development across that continuum through third grade.
So next we have Matthew Wire from the National Conference of State Legislatures, and I met him this summer and was so pleased that he was able to join us because I think he can bring a different perspective to state leadership roles in this area. But one of the things I think is important to know about Matthew is, he really understands the opportunities and the challenges that exist in early learning because he brings firsthand experience to this work. For 3 years, he was a bilingual kindergarten teacher in the Denver Public Schools. So I love that we have a different teacher perspective to bring to this conversation in addition to his current role with working with the legislatures. So Matt, North Carolina's plan, they talked about the legislation to promote this collaboration at the local level. And I know that NCSL has been tracking state legislation as it relates to ESSA. And so I've been very interested in what they've been finding and talking to him a lot about that. So, what can you tell us about the approach that other legislatures have taken to support early childhood? Within this process, did any states specifically pass legislation based on the development of the ESSA plan as it relates to early childhood? And then what do you see for future opportunities? We talked about the plan isn't done, it's the starting point. So where's the starting point in the road ahead for state legislatures?
So just quickly to touch on the North Carolina bill, we're hosting a Education and Health and Human Services Chairs Conference next week in Nashville, where we'll be gathering about 75 or 80 chairs to really help them kind of think through this legislation and what it means, what kind of potential it might have for them, and kind of helping to break down those silos between the committees and really help to set up continuums for supporting all those students in their state, especially on the the birth through third grade spectrum. So just touching on some legislative actions around the state, I just wanted to mention first that legislator involvement has varied tremendously. I had actually a few legislators last week with our Early Learning Fellows program who mentioned that the state plans are in, so now they have no more say. I think there's some perceptions out there that these things are finished and that legislators are no longer needed. So just trying to reiterate to them that these are not static, that as has been mentioned several times, these are evolving and that their input's very much needed. So on one end of the spectrum, Delaware actually passed a House resolution that required their involvement with the state education agency to walk through these plans and present them to their House and Senate Ed committees. So there's that end of their involvement. There's also states like Colorado, South Dakota, and it sounds like North Carolina and others who have been very active and involved in the process. So some of the bills, most of the bills are around just technical changes and accountability systems. And I think Jim mentioned, we're setting kind of a low bar, hoping that, down the road, that more innovation can happen, but they're kind of setting their bar low with legislation. One innovative bill that I'd like to highlight for this audience that you might find useful is Colorado Senate Bill 103, which was passed this session. And that's Senator Mike Merrifield, who part of your question was thinking it through how SEAs have helped legislators think through and what kind of legislation has been driven regarding ESSA. So what this bill does, it uses early childhood education as a core turnaround strategy. And just to kind of highlight a few elements within that bill, it directs the SEA to provide TA and support to districts and schools that have identified schools in the lowest 5%. It also, and folks at this panel can also definitely talk to more specifics than I can, but it also serves students, it requires the needs assessment be conducted to determine if there are quality pre-K programs serving that school in that neighborhood, in that school zone. It also requires the Colorado Early Childhood Council to become involved in the process, requires collaboration with pre-K providers and programs to enhance those transitions from pre-K into the kindergarten space, joint personal or professional development, explicit parent engagement plan in the P3 sector there. They have some mentions of home visiting, early intervention processes, and I can't really speak to what that looks like, but they're thinking about this in the legislation and how they can really set up a strong foundation in those schools that continually are underperforming. So I just wanted to highlight that as a piece of legislation that I thought was very research-based, very innovative, and it's not just because I'm from Colorado, but I was tracking this bill all the way through, and off the record, I was hoping it would get through, and it made it through. So just looking ahead to 2018, just trying to think through some areas where legislation might be impactful. Again, refocusing on accountability systems and really making sure that those are serving all students, disaggregating data, really requiring meaningful reporting and that's very transparent for the public, especially in districts where students are underperforming consistently. And this is kind of a side note, but I think there's so much variation in legislator knowledge of your ESSA plans across all the states. So if you have an opportunity to really engage those folks, I think you're going to see more introduced or drafted bills that might be able to support your efforts. And I know that's kind of generally speaking, but some other examples would include, I've seen a lot of interest around the fifth indicator, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But I want to make sure that our folks, legislators, aren't just focused on chronic absenteeism. I think that's been a very common kind of, we should put that in because we already track it, and I think all of us know that, singularly that might not be the best method. So there's lots of other things that we're, at NCSL, trying to kind of reiterate to them to include. And I think Danielle will touch on a lot more of those elements that are around the states. I presented in Ohio to a task force on education and poverty a couple weeks ago, and about half of that panel was very interested, legislators were interested in the new per pupil expenditure reporting requirement under ESSA and how they can really help their state identify schools at the school level how those funding inequities might be happening. I said it and their ears perked up, and I think they might have been half asleep when I was talking, but whatever I said that, they perked right up. So I think there are elements that we can all consider there. And just a couple quick things on our half at NCSL. I'll be putting together a publication in December to kind of preview or help legislators as they enter their 2018 session. So part of my idea for that is to really focus on these ESSA state plans, the innovative P3 elements. So I'm very excited to hear what the next round sounds like, and eager to hear feedback from you guys about what might go in there to kind of help folks across the country really think about. And lastly, just to close, my colleague and I just started a new project funded by the Kellogg Foundation that's looking at educating and equipping legislators with data and research on the opportunity gap and how that plays into school readiness. And I know that's a large piece of the P3 spectrum. So we'll be having a conference in November, a lot of funding to support TA in states. We'll be developing a few legis briefs, which are kind of our front and back policy briefs. There's a few websites. We'll be in a couple states in the next couple of years. So, and I can share those resources as they arise if you find that helpful for your work too. Thank you.
All right, so now we're gonna move to a conversation about what's actually in the ESSA plans. So the American Institutes for Research operates a number of federally funded centers, regional centers, national centers, and so for us it's important to know what's happening in the states so we know how our centers can best support you in the room. We did a review of the first round of ESSA plans, and then we partnered with Education Council. We hosted a briefing in Washington, D.C., and we have a video of it up on our website to really talk about sort of what our early insights were from the first round of plans. And then we started talking because we have very similar needs in sort of how we're not advocacy organizations, but we're really interested in knowing how we can support the people that we work with. And so we started to collaborate on a review of the second round of ESSA plans, which were just submitted. But knowing this conference was coming up, we really fast-tracked a review of the early childhood sections of the plan because we thought it would make for a really good conversation here today. And so Danielle's going to talk to you a little bit about what our teams have found, with the caveat that we've only had this data for about 24 hours. So she's going to, only say what she can speak confidently to, but really, we'll be looking at this, over the next couple days and sort of figuring out what is it that we really see in these plans and how can we share this information further. So she's going to give you a little bit of insights in what we found from our review. I think many of you may know Danielle, but one of the things that I think is important to highlight about her former work that sort of helps bring her expertise in how she looks at these plans. So what I thought was interesting is that she actually worked at the U.S. Department of Education in the Office of Migrant Education. So from the federal level, in terms of how you implement legislation and policy, she sort of has that perspective of how the federal government might be promoting this. But she also worked in she was the director of the Office of Early Education in the District of Columbia Public Schools. So she also has the flip side of being in a district and understanding the realities of implementing it. And so not just what's in the plan, but how's it actually going to happen? And so I think she really brings this wonderful perspective to how she's been looking at the data. And so I'm very excited that we were able to pull this together. So if you do have a question for her and she says, I really can't answer that now, please understand it's because we want to make sure that we're really providing accurate information. But we want to hear your questions because that's going to help us figure out how do we want to look at what we're finding in these plans. So, so one of the things that we talked about is kind of when you looked at all this, like what stood out to you? How are the plans similar to what happened in April? But maybe were they different because there was that time period where the states who are submitting in the later round had time to adjust? And what surprised you?
Good. Let me start with a couple more caveats in addition to, well, the plans were the last set of plans were just submitted last week. Some of them have not yet been submitted. I spent much of the last year talking about the law itself and then the first 17 states that were submitted. Some of you have heard me give that presentation. This is not that presentation. I'm happy to share that very detailed, what the law says about early childhood, where states drill down. This is a much higher level overview presentation, so take that for what it is. And if I say something wrong about your state, please come up and tell me that, but don't quote me because, as Trish just said, this is all new data. A couple other things. I loved the morning presentation about what Georgia has done because it's so comprehensive, right? And it gives you such a beautiful picture of how you can invest in birth through 5-year-olds or third graders. And I know many of you were sitting here thinking, gosh, that's so great. They're so fortunate that they had the support of their governor and they could put money into that their legislature would allocate money. And what I want to say to you is, well, you may not be able to get to the full comprehensive approach that Georgia has taken through ESSA. The ESSA flexibility lets you use those dollars for some of those really innovative and thoughtful things that Georgia talked about. And so I encourage you to see in your minds the vision of where you want to go and think about how ESSA can be the driver or the lever to get there. And hopefully some of my comments will help you with that. And I'm happy to answer specific questions about where the money is, and anybody here on the panel can do that, and how different states have done that. But those are a couple of things to think about. So go ahead and go to the first slide. Jim talked about how there have been many, many opportunities to invest in early childhood coming out of the feds, the preschool development grants, the Race to Talk Early Learning Challenge, that lots of states are doing work to create systems. What I always hear when I hear that sentence is that early childhood people are entrepreneurial. Or as I say in my worst moments, we cannibalize everybody else's money, right? Like, we're like Pac-Man, you got money, you got money, you got money, you got money, feed me, feed me, feed me. This is another place to be entrepreneurial, but it's also really important to remember that looking at how the Every Student Succeeds Act can support early childhood is not just about finding money for slots for 4-year-olds or ways to improve the quality of what happens in 1 year of pre-K, that the opportunity from where I sit that the Act provides us is to begin to systemically approach the creation of a birth to third grade system. And so some of the innovations, some of the levers, some of the ways we've seen states approach this, they don't talk about 4-year-olds. They don't talk about babies. It's about looking at those K-1, 2 students as the first step because they have those kids. And that might be an easier thing to bite off than to say, hey, we're going to pay for 3s and 4s, or we're going to start a home visiting program for babies and toddlers, right? All of which you can do under ESSA, but that might be a step too far for some people. So as I talk, you're going to hear me reflect that whole continuum of birth to third grade and where we can really use the law to leverage that. But I want to start with this first slide. I think you can all see it. This is straight out of the Colorado state plan. And it is that, it's nothing very sophisticated. It's those levers that come out of PowerPoint. You can just click and there's the box. But what those levers describe is the state model of continuous improvement. And when I looked at this the first time, you can see the first one is about money, allocation, award funding. The second one is about risk assessment, monitoring. The third one is technical assistance, and then there's program effectiveness, and they have different names: application, monitoring, TA, and continuous improvement. When I look at that, I see early childhood, because that's what we do all the time. We figure out what we want to do, we pay for it, we evaluate the quality, are we doing it right, and we come back and we do it again. So that's the first thing to think about when you think about those levers. But far more importantly to this conversation, what I want you to all know is that this is the big picture approach that your state is taking to implement ESSA, to do those next steps of, we've written the plan, we have our itinerary, now where do we go? And if you all as early childhood people aren't involved with each piece of this continuous improvement and monitoring process, you're missing an opportunity to ask really important questions at the state and local level about how early childhood can be part of every school's approach to helping their children do better and to be successful. And note that I said how, not whether. We want to say, where is early childhood, not is early childhood. Get away from yes/no questions, get to open-ended questions, and we'll get a lot further in integrating early childhood into the systems that ESSA supports. So that's my big overview piece. Also a bit of my soapbox, which I will now step down from. Okay, those of you who know me know I never get off my soapbox, but I'll pretend. So as Trish said, she asked me to look at the data from the new plans and think about what the themes are, what's different, and what we can do from here. So this first slide is really some of the new themes that I saw emerge. And some of you are going to go, wow, those things are new, because we've been doing those for years, baby. But they were newly present in how the plans talk about them. And so the first thing that I want to highlight is that while many of us have talked about early childhood as an equity conversation, that access to high quality can help close those achievement gaps as early as possible, and that we have seen in the state plans that different states are using early childhood as a way to close gaps for subgroups, homeless children, language minority children, that it was really exciting to see at least one state, Washington, call out access to full day K as an equity issue, as a way to close those opportunity gaps in their plan. And I think that's a really important approach, and I encourage other folks to think about it that way. We saw some other things like that in the earlier drafts, but it was very present in how Washington and a couple of other states talked about it. Second, it was very present in the new round of plans, the role of districts in successful implementation. 2 states that I saw to start with actually called out in their long-term goals the role of school districts in guaranteeing access to high-quality early childhood. In Nebraska, for instance, by 2026, which is their long-term goal point, and believe me, if we have to wait to 2026 for this to happen, we'll all bang our heads against a wall, but hey, it's in there, so it's good. But by 2026, 95% of their school districts will have identified at least one high-quality early childhood program available to every preschool student in their district. That's a really high goal. I love that goal. That again is about equity, but it's importantly putting the emphasis on the role district leaders will play in making these services available to kids. Many of you have heard us talk about, everybody at this table talk about how early childhood can be a core component of school improvement strategies. That actually came out much more in this last round of plans. I think all of the 17 or so of us that have been going around the country saying this, it finally took, and I feel really good about that. And the way that it came out was in a couple of ways. State plans talked about the resource equity issue, that preschool, at least preschool, would be included in how how resources are calculated and how equity is calculated. A number of states listed early childhood interventions, either pre-literacy or actually access to services, as one of the interventions that can be on the table. And other folks talked about coaching school leaders to understand the child development and school readiness better as part of their school improvement strategy. So you see that. We also saw a lot more in this round information on the progression of young students, pre-kindergarten to 3rd grade, as critical to school success. For a long, long time in school reform, we talk a big game, but we really talk about starting at 3rd grade and in some cases 2nd grade. In many of the state plans, I saw a much more aligned approach to building information. And that came across in a number of ways. Some states have adopted assessments that will go from pre-K or K into 1st, 2nd. Some states are now trading data across different auspices, that is from the early childhood community into schools and other places. So you'll see that. The next one is that states are really focusing on the transition and coordination. As Jim talked about, CCSSO is writing a wonderful resource on transition and coordination and how states and districts can do that. North Carolina has important language in their plan that pushes local folks to do much better transition coordination. And a number of other states have very specific language about what good transition looks like, but we saw that a lot more in this round. And finally, early literacy is omnipresent in many of the plans, partially because the accountability system looks at English language assessments, right? Folks are starting to think much earlier about where they can do literacy, and we didn't see this as prominently in the first round. What's the same and what makes me happy? Data, 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 data. So there's data in the plans, and it's starting to really address young children. I think it's really interesting that states are even thinking about how they can include some early childhood components in their report cards. We saw a little bit more of this in this round than in the previous round, but it was mentioned. Kentucky is going to report on what percentage of their young kids are in full day versus half day K in their report cards. They're also going to report on centers and their quality ratings in their report cards. So I think that's a great first step. The second one, as you've heard several times, chronic absenteeism. The majority of states that have submitted have a chronic absenteeism measure as their 5th indicator of school quality student success in their accountability systems. Most of them start at K, not pre-K. There's benefits and costs to putting it in pre-K and K. It can be a great measure for those younger children and knowing where kids might need more interventions and where families might need more supports, as long as it's not used punitively against schools and, more importantly, against families. But chronic absenteeism can really be, we're beginning to understand, that canary in the coal mine, and it's very exciting that states are at least putting it into their accountability systems, and then we'll be providing technical assistance to schools on how to use it. We saw in the first round, Illinois led the way by having a reference to an indicator or a measure of K2 in their accountability systems. In this last round, more states followed that path. I think this is a truly interesting development. Most of those assessments are talking about literacy. As you all know better than most audiences I talk to, we don't have great measures on these things. And so how you use those measures, what they communicate, how they affect teaching and learning at the school level, how they affect district decisions about resources and interventions for kids will be really important. But just the fact that we're starting to recognize that if we're not looking at the data on young kids before they get to 3rd grade and really tracking that progress in a meaningful way that changes what happens at the school and classroom level, we won't actually get those long-term changes we need. And importantly, while I said K2, a lot of these systems are connecting back to pre-K to track that data. We saw in both rounds a focus on social emotional skills, largely through standards that are aligned from birth through 3rd grade and beyond. And on assessments that are about the whole child, which is really exciting. In the last round, Delaware had 2 whole pages on how they were going to support the whole child. In this round, we saw many more states that talked about that. I wrote down 3 states that actually use the words whole child in their plan. Believe me, that's a very small step, but it's a big, meaningful way to talk about kids. Alaska, Georgia, and Hawaii were those 3 states that actually used those words, and I was super excited about that. Wait, go back to There's actually supposed to be a 5th bullet on this slide, which is one of those things why we gave you the caveat that we just made these slides, which is that throughout both rounds, professional development for school and district leaders on school readiness and child development from birth to 8th grade has come out as a big, big new development. The law itself changed the definition of professional development and explicitly encouraged districts and states to think about professional development that is jointly held with the community, and that was very present in the state plans on PD. And again, this can be a game changer at the local level, because the more teachers and principals understand child development and can change their classrooms to reflect how children are able to learn most efficiently and effectively, you start to see things like those class scores go up, because teachers better understand how to work with kids, and then you start to see better achievement in classrooms. Now you can go, Trish. Many of you have seen this slide, because this is okay, you're not done, what are you gonna do next? And again, in every area of ESSA, there are big policy questions that affect early childhood, and I put them up on the slide, you all can look at them down the line, but they're about systems. So next slide. But so what's next as you all move forward? And I think this is really important. As we've all talked about on the panel, the very next step is about districts writing their own plans to make the state plans actionable and meaningful. And so really at the state level, you all asking the questions about how those plans will incorporate early childhood from pre-K to 3rd grade, or preferably birth to 3rd grade, will be really important. One question, whether it's on the fiscal monitoring side, whether it's on your uses of Title I, whether it's just a big question about how are you integrating, coordinating to support whichever goal it fits into, is really important. Continuing to look at improved coordination at the state and local level. The law actually requires that the state plan be coordinated with a number of other federal programs, including your child care subsidy program and IDEA. From what I can tell, most states kind of blew past that requirement, and nobody seems to care except me, but that's okay. We will get this done. So the more coordination you can do with those different systems to serve younger children will be really important, and raising awareness of how to coordinate with those other systems at the local level will change outcomes for kids and is an important piece to communicate. I started with the state continuous improvement and monitoring system. So again, how will the monitoring system support that alignment between early childhood and early elementary programs? And finally, and I think for you all sitting at these tables, the biggest question, what TA can you do? What guidance can you write that will help districts do this? And I think there's lots of places you can write about PD and how the Title II money can be used for coaches to support better classroom instruction for young kids. You can do TA around what kind of data is available so that schools know where kids have been before they walk through the school door, the kind of programs they've had. You can help them with their needs assessments to do a landscape analysis. You can talk about why early childhood is an evidence-based intervention and really encourage districts to include it in their school improvement plans for those schools at risk. So I'm out of time, so I will stop talking and we will take questions.
One of the things that I've been sort of listening to and really curious about was the role of stakeholder engagement in the development of the ESSA plans. And as I said, we did, American Institute of Research did a review of the first rounds, and so we had a lot of conversations. And one of the things was about, how meaningful is this stakeholder engagement? And some people thought, oh, it's really great, and some people thought, oh, they're not doing a really great job at all. But what was interesting was that I heard the most interesting stories around early childhood, how the advocates came to the table. John, you talked about in North Carolina the important role they played. I'm curious, does anyone in the room who was involved in your state have a story about how stakeholder engagement helped you move the needle?
Let me make a point about that, because I think the model that we saw with early childhood stakeholder groups really influencing the conversation and having meaningful input in the plan set the stage for other groups, our business community, et cetera, to really kind of come forward and offer their opinion as well. It was interesting in the early days of the ESSA planning. I saw many presentations that were about stakeholder engagement that were really more informative in nature, where representatives from the department would stand in front of groups and say, we're submitting our ESSA plan, we have this date, blah, 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 and just really sort of walk through the particulars of what was going to happen, but didn't meaningfully engage the audience in any way. And so what the early childhood work did was really provide an example for how North Carolina could engage not only early childhood stakeholders, but others to come and inform a better plan.
Okay. All right, well, Jim, I want to go back to a comment that you made during your remarks. You talked and you mentioned it just ever so slightly about some missed opportunities in the plans. And so as we continue to talk about that they're not done, it's an evolution. So can you talk a little bit about what you saw as maybe some opportunities to build upon?
I think they're all opportunities, so it's hard to select out any individual ones. One of the things that struck me when I was reading an article the other day was about this whole decolonization of education, where things are moving from really the federal level, dictating what shall be, more to the states, but increasingly to the local level, the district level. And I think that that's an opportunity that many states are going to need some assistance with, is really how do you empower the LEAs in creating seamless transition for children, in providing for professional development opportunities, in ensuring that every, say, elementary principal is knowledgeable about early childhood and not just there because they are also the high school football coach, or, I mean, we do those things. I hope it's not true. So I think that the early childhood leaders in the SEAs actually know what the opportunities are, but those opportunities need to be matched with what their needs are. So, for example, in Mississippi, one of the key areas, as I understand it, is the potential teaching shortage, particularly around P3. And so how do you engage higher education with that effectively? And how do you entice career and technical centers and teachers at that level to be able to really promote these type of opportunities? So that's just a couple of examples, I think, that we can look to. But it's going to mean really figuring out how to stop dictating for LEAs and really encouraging, and that's, I think, where the coaching comes in as well. Without coaches, many of these things will just be aspirations, unrealized aspirations.
So I was recently in a state talking with them about their ESSA planning, and I've actually done some state planning, so I know what an overwhelming process this is because you are really pulling in so many different perspectives and engaging stakeholders. It is a really big investment of time. So when we were talking, I asked them, well, what are you thinking about the district planning process? And they basically said, we're not. We've got a process in place, we're going to use that. And I think part of that was because being so involved in the plan, that's sort of like the next step, and we'll think about that a little bit later. So it was really gratified, John, to hear you talking actively about the thinking in the state around the district plan. And I'm wondering if you can sort of answer this in two ways. There's the early childhood perspective of the larger district plan. And I'm curious, when you were talking about the activity in the state around district planning, is it really in the early childhood piece? Is the state agency itself really actively on that right now? What's the change that's happening or the work that's happening around the district planning process?
Well, for us, when we thought about the opportunities that existed and really bringing these stakeholders together to inform the state level plan, we knew, and I knew, personally, how the resources are spent at the local level is what makes a difference. And so we thought about what are the resources we have that can support district level planning. And so working very closely with our Head Start State Collaboration Office, with the Early Learning, North Carolina Early Childhood Foundation, with our North Carolina Partnership for Children, Smart Start, we're putting together this network of meetings and awareness sessions, first to bring it to the attention of district leaders, but also to start to build those bridges and relationships, particularly where they don't exist, and start those conversations in communities about the opportunities to spend these resources, and not just singularly these resources, but in collaboration with the Child Care Block Grant money that flows out of the state, et cetera, to think about how you put together supports and as Danielle mentioned, think systemically about building a system of early care and education from birth through grade 3 to support child success.
And you're starting that right now, first one, October 26th.
Yes. We just got in place the contract with the Early Childhood Foundation to start to move forward with this planning process. So in October, we'll be hitting the ground running.
Great. So Danielle, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit, we were limited in what we were going to talk today about what's in the ESSA plans because after 24 hours you have to sort of be careful. But I know that there are things that probably caught your attention that you want to explore and dig in a little deeper. So where's the next step that you see you're going to be sort of focusing once you get back home?
I think that there are a couple things. One is I really want to better understand how the K2 indicators are being used to understand progress and how we can build a PD system in states to support that from early childhood into K so that kids are prepared, so that providers know what the school districts are looking at, so school districts know what kids have been exposed to, and that we make sure that we're tracking all the right things. So that'd be the first thing. The second thing is I actually think successful transitions and coordination at the local level, driven from the school district into outreach with early childhood programs in the community, is the secret sauce, the success to a lot of this, to building systems. And there's some really great transition coordination language in the plans, both this round and the last round. And I think that's one of the places that we will do some really serious work and look at what's happening. And finally, I know that there are at least 3 states that identified one of their plan activities was to create an aligned professional development system from birth to 3rd grade. Delaware is working on that, Michigan has it in their plan, and there was one more in this round. And I think figuring out how to connect those folks, make sure they have the resources they need, helping folks think through what an aligned PD system actually means will be part of the next big round of work. So those are the big ones. And the district plan, I cannot say enough about how important the structure of the district plans and the monitoring process will be to helping to build these systems. So we'll do that too.
Okay. And then Matt, I had a question for you. You talked about your conference in Nashville next week, which I'm sort of interested in. And I'm curious, what plans do you have to sort of report out? How can we find out sort of what happened there?
I'm not entirely sure how we're going to be sharing that, and I think a lot of that might be kind of state specific and kind of embargoed within our organization. But any PowerPoint slides, resources that are at that meeting, I can definitely share. And I think a piece of that conversation might be shared in that publication I mentioned that might come out, later this year. Sorry, I don't have a better answer because I think we would all want to know what they talk about. But part of our, the reason we are where we are is we don't, open the door and record it and put it on the internet because there's a lot of interesting things said at those meetings. I'm sure you're all.
Well, maybe we could do a webinar and you can
Yeah.
give us the highlights from that meeting. Does anyone else have any questions for our panelists? Because we're going to move into our break next. So if you have questions and you'd like to talk to them individually, we have time for a break now before we go into our breakout sessions. So Beth, do you want to give them just some directions about where to go next for the breakouts?